Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. Perhaps even good night. My name is Alberto Trocoli, and I'm here to present and actually chair this webinar on Discover the Copernicus Climate Change Service ECEM energy data for the European energy sector. This is part of the series of webinars offered to you by the European Climatic Energy Mixes, ECEM. So ECEM is part of the Copernicus Climate Change Service project and is developing in close collaboration with the stakeholders of the energy sector a demonstrator to assess how well different energy supply mixes in Europe will meet demand over different time horizons, focusing on the role of climate on the mixes. Just briefly, this is the schematic that the ECEM project has followed. So we focused initially on the climate variables. We looked at producing the best climate variables we could, and then these were converted into energy variables at the bottom here. And these are then displayed together with the climate variables into the demonstrator that looks something like this. And we also provide a lot of documentation, skill assessments, case studies, and so on. But today, with this webinar, we want to focus on this area, the energy variables. We have three excellent speakers today for our webinar. The first one, Dr. Laurent Debout from EDF, will talk about the energy variables for the European domain, focusing on demand and wind power. Then we have a talk on hydropower energy modeling by Dr. Matteo De Felice from Enea, Italy. And the third talk is about solar power generation that is given by Dr. Yves-Marie Senat-Drenan of Mines ParisTech, France. And as I said, I'm the chair of the session, and we'll have question and answer at the end, so that prepare your question and the speakers will reply to those at the end of the presentation. So the talk, the webinar overall is around an hour. We can go a little bit beyond, but we timed it so that we should finish by an hour. So now it's around 14 UTC. We should finish at 15 UTC or thereabout. The format, as I said, is with three presentations followed by question and answer. There is a tab on your GoToWebinar control panel for questions, and you can ask questions at any time. You can also direct your question to a specific person if you wish, to a specific speaker of the three, or just leave it open and we will see who is the best placed, or perhaps the three of the speakers can address the same question. We'll display the questions at the end, so you can also view them online while we respond to them. The webinar is recorded and will be available online shortly after the presentation. So I will now give the floor to Laurent, the first speaker, and enjoy the webinar.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Just waiting a second to share the screen. Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Laurent. Yes.
Sorry. Okay, you should see my screen, I hope, now in full screen mode.
It's
so,
can you go into...
First, yeah, is it okay?
Yes, okay now, sorry, thanks.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, sorry, we need to inform you that there's a short lag between the slides, but normally no more than 1 or 2 seconds. So this first talk will be a brief overview and description about the energy variables that we calculated for the European domain, and I will make a little bit more focus on demand and wind power. Of course, this is a collaborative work with all the ECEM team, with the main contributors from this full package listed here. So the outline of the talk will be the following. I will really briefly talk about the overall target of the ECEM and the structure. Then I will review the energy variables. in terms of what we aim to do, what were our methodologies, assumptions, and the input data sets we used. And I will then make an overview of all those variables, emphasizing demand and wind power, as Yves-Marie and Mathieu will go into more details for hydro and solar in their talks after mine. So the rationale behind ECEM was that with climate change and energy transition and so on, many people at different levels are asking what energy mixes will look like in 2050 compared to today. And so there have been a lot of studies trying to assess how electricity systems will react to a massive inclusion of renewable generation. These are a few plots from some of those studies. The common point in all of these is that the climate variability and climate change has been taken into account in general in a very simple way, and we really think that there is a lot of space to improve those approaches. So the idea of ECEM was to have a global approach and to provide at the European scale information on energy supply and demand from the different sources and for different time periods. So I will concentrate on this part of the project. So our targets are four main variables. The first one is electricity demand, basically at country level, but hopefully later at a finer geographical scale. And the three other variables are generation from wind power, solar power, only PV, because there's not much concentrating solar power installed in Europe currently, and hydropower. And so the overall goal of the project is really to assess the effects of climate variability and climate change on electricity demand and generation at the whole scale of Europe. For this, we were working on three different periods. The first one, which we call historical, is, let's say, the recent past from 1979 to 2016. So it's basically because the underlying climate variable are the era interim analysis data set from ECMWF. And the two others are seasonal forecasts. We will not talk about that today because the work is not yet complete. And the third time period is climate projections. So that's to say from the same historical period until 2065. Of course, to do that, we need installed capacity and mean demand level, so some basic energy information. And we choose to use public data sets and especially the ENSOE historical data for installed capacity and the energy mixes scenarios from the eHighway 2050 project, which you have the link in the presentation and you will be able to look at it closer. We don't have time to go into details today. Then in terms of methodology, when you are targeting to calculate energy variables, so let's say, for instance, wind power generation, and based on climate variables, in this case, it would be wind speed, you have basically two different ways to do it. The first one, if you know the transfer function to go from wind speed to wind power generation or from solar radiation to solar power output and so on, it's simply to use this transfer function. So that requires that you know this transfer function. Of course, you need less generation data to do that because you don't need to train your model based on data, but you need at least some data to validate your model. But on the other side, this approach requires information and detailed information about the wind farm characteristics or the solar farm characteristics or the hydropower plant and so on, which is not always available. The second approach is to build statistical models, which are symbolized here with this F-hat function, which is a priori unknown and that you will calibrate empirically based on actual data. So of course, in this case, you don't especially need a priori requirements on plant characteristics, but you need good quality and long enough data sets to calibrate your models. So in all cases, anyway, whether it is for model calibration or for model validation, data is really a very important aspect of this process, and it's always an issue when you look at energy variables. Indeed, what we've done in ECEM was to base all our calculations on public datasets, because everything that is in Copernicus Climate Change Service must be at the end available freely and openly to the public. So we use the ENSOE data, so either from their transparency portal, which provides a lot of information for most countries in Europe at hourly time resolution, and with some consistency in data formats and so on. But we also use the annual statistics, which are a posteriori validated data, knowing that the transparency portal is not always validated. It's put in a portal but not validated at first glance. But we also use other data sources, for instance, from the World Bank, from national transmission system operators like National Grid in the UK or RTE in France. We base also our calculations on the windpower.net database of wind power farms in Europe. And we also used other projects results to compare our own calculations. For instance, for wind energy, we compared our outputs with the NINJA from Imperial College in London and the Joint Research Center, European Union Joint Research Center, EMIRES project for wind also. The problem is that we have a lot of issues with data. As a few examples, I just put here a plot for wind capacity factor in France. So you can see the red curve is the RTE data, so the national TSO data, and the bluish time series is that which is available on the ENSOE transparency platform. And you can see that there are some differences between both, whereas in principle they should be almost the same. And in addition, in the ENSOE data portal, there's some gap in the data around the end of the time series, and so we have to face such issues in a number of occasions. So we have some lack of data, discontinuities, differences in the parameters of the data which are provided and measured, and so on. So this is to be taken into account in building the models and in validating them a posteriori. Another issue, for instance, we had was about the wind farms data from the windpower.net database, because for some of the wind farms we have all the necessary information like the installed capacity, the turbine type, the height, and so on. But especially for the oldest wind farms, not all the information is available, and you have to make assumptions when you want to use the dataset. So data issues are really important. They are very time consuming. We spent a lot of time on these aspects in the project, and work is still ongoing to address this for future projects. And in particular, we are trying to link different initiatives, notably through the World Energy and Meteorology Council's special interest group on data exchange sharing and formats. You can find information on that on the WMC website. So we now go into the overview of the energy variables. I will be very brief for hydropower because Matteo will detail this in a few minutes. But basically, the approach we took was to use statistical models for some countries only, because there's not much hydro in many countries in Europe. But Matteo will describe this later in a few minutes. Concerning solar power, so we use the physical model because we have one which we think is quite good, and even very good. And in this case, we were able to compute the capacity factor and power and energy for all the countries in Europe. Yves-Marie will give more details in a few minutes. Let me now come to demand. So the approach which was taken is what is commonly used in energy companies, and it's based on statistical models using generalized additive models. So one of these models was built for each individual country in Europe, except Albania, because we didn't have enough data at the time when it was done. And I will give you a little details about that. So basically, the principle of the modelization is that in demand you have long-term trends due to economic activities, population change, and so on. And so the first step in our models was to remove this long-term trend when there's one. For some countries we don't have any trend, but for most of them we have. So the first idea is to use the first model to detrend the monthly time series. In general, for most countries, we have data back to 1991 or 1995, so we have quite a long history of those data to be able to assess the long-term trend. This trend is then removed, and we end up with a daily time series of load data, which can be modeled in a second way with a second GAN model using the climate variables. So the second step, which is in fact this path here, is exactly corresponding to the modelization of the climate dependence part of the demand. So at the end, you end up with a detrended daily demand, to which you can remove the long-term mean and calculate the trended anomaly, or if you include again the trend you had estimated at the beginning, you can get the full demand at the end. So those models were built up for every country in Europe. And the advantage is that when you go to climate projections, so sorry, this was made for the historical period. And then once you have the models, so that means the parameters which allow you to compute the demand based on the climate variables, then you can reuse the same models with climate projections. And that's what we have done. So using the detrended demand models, we could make those projections and then compute also the relative anomalies. And in addition, so I will not go into the details today, but the AI project provides 5 different scenarios for future energy mixes with associated to these 5 demand scenarios. And so we could recompute the absolute values of demand for those 5 scenarios. Just a quick view of the validations we made. So here you have some scatter plots for 4 countries. So you have Austria, Germany, France, and the UK. On the x-axis, you have the ECEM estimated demand, and on the y-axis, you have the ENSOE values. And you can see that the fit is very good for most countries. There are some of them for which we have some problems, for instance, Luxembourg, because we have a problem with the input data, but yeah, it's not that crucial. And you can see on the right side of the plot that where you have for all the countries, you have the mean absolute percentage error for each of the countries on the model. And the interesting one is the orange curve. And you can see that except for Luxembourg, where we have problem, and maybe Switzerland and Greece, maybe for all other countries, the MAPE is lower than 3%, or maybe closer to 2%, which is very good, and not that far from operational demand models. We're now switching to wind power. So for this, we use different models and modeling approaches because we had observations of wind power production, so we could set up statistical models, which are represented on the right side. The problem is that we didn't have data for all the countries. So for the gray countries on the map, we don't have models. For all the other one, it's okay. So the training was made on the 2015 and 16 data from ENSOE, from the transparency portal. So training on 1 year and validation on the other year, and then the reverse. And then once the model was set up, we reconstructed the whole period from 1979 to 2016. So the statistical model used are SVR, so singular vector regression, which are quite simple and easy and fast to run. But we also used a different approach based on physical models. By physical models, we mean using a determined power curve. In fact, we computed capacity factors at grid point level. If you have followed our previous seminars, you remember probably that our basic grid is 0.5 by 0.5 degree, so more or less 50 kilometers. So we have wind speed at this spatial resolution. And so we used the power curve from 3 different wind turbines, which are listed here. So 3 different models with different power curve, but not that different. And at the end, as the results hold, the 3 turbines are quite similar. We decided that in the demonstrator we will keep only the Vestas one, but it doesn't make a big change. So the idea is that you consider you have the same wind turbine installed everywhere in an homogeneous share in Europe, and at the end you aggregate the capacity factor at country level. We also started to implement a more accurate physical model, considering the windpower.net database, which allows to calculate the more accurate wind power output from the real actual wind farm fleet, sorry, in Europe. We still have some issues with this one, and we will not talk about it today, but it seems very promising and will allow in the near future to improve the calculations. So here are the details of the calculations. I will not go into the details, but you will have the slide afterwards. So basically, in the physical approach, you first need to interpolate the wind speed, which is available only at 10 meters from our models, to the abate, and in the physical approach, we choose a single abate of 100 meters, and then you use the power curve to calculate the capacity factor. In the statistical model approach, you directly compute the capacity factor, which is estimated from the ENSOE database, based on the wind speed at 10 meters. So you avoid the interpolation step to 100 meters. I will not go into more details for that, just a quick validation slide for the statistical models. First, here you can see for all the countries for which we could make the calculations, the mean value of the capacity factor in blue over the year 2016, and the black bar is the observation from ENSOE. And you can see that, remember that the models were trained only on 1 year of data, because we don't have more for the moment from ENSOE. And so, of course, if the year of training is different from the year of validation in terms of observed wind speed, this explains the differences you see in the models. Of course, if we have a longer period for training, it will improve the results. But you can see already that the statistical model does a very good job, except for a few countries, in particular Austria and Latvia. But for the other one, it's very good. This is a validation plot for the physical approach. So it's over France, and you can see the black line is the RT, so the official data from the national TSO. The red curve is the ECEM physical model, so very simplified model, and the blue and green are from the Ninja and MRS project, which are in principle much more precise than ECEM. But you can see that with this very simplified approach of a single wind turbine all over Europe, of course you can't get exactly the absolute values of the capacity factor, but the correlation is extremely good. I don't have the number there, but it's close to 0.98, so it's very good, very good. And this very simplified approach can allow to assess the variability in power production due to the variability in wind speed. Final plot for validation. It's a little bit complex maybe, but here for all the countries you have 6 different models. So once again you have, let's say ECEM. You can look at it as a green or blue bar. Then you have the physical approach in gray, the statistical model in orange, and the GRC, MRS, and Ninja in green and red. We won't go into the details, but what is important to say is that in some countries, like France, for instance, most models are consistent, and it's okay. But there are some countries where there are differences, and sometimes ECEM is closer to Ninja, sometimes it's closer to GRT, and it's not that clear And so the message about that is that you should probably use different models to estimate your power output, because there are some uncertainties in the calculations. Anyway, we will do additional work to better understand those differences. Well, that's it. I'd like to give back the word to Alberto, and I welcome your question at the end of the webinar. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Laurent. That was a great presentation, and you managed to squeeze 2 years of work into 20 minutes. It was a brilliant effort. And I forgot to mention actually that indeed the project has gone about 2 years now since the start, and it's got 2-3 months left, but there's likely going to be some more further work. Well, there will be under Copernicus Climate Change Service for energy, so keep watching this space. But now we have another presentation, a great talk from Matteo, who's going to tell us about hydropower modeling with the ECEM data. So over to you, Matteo, please. Matteo, perhaps unmute.
Okay. Hi everyone. So let me. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Showing just. Okay. So I'm trying to set up. Here we are. Okay. So in this brief presentation, I want just to show how work on hydropower. I want to take the chance to highlight the fact that in one of the goals of the project was to provide a generalized methodology that is generalized methodology that could work for all the European countries. This is a very important point, and I will show you why in this presentation. Okay, the reason, the main question is why it's important to model hydropower. So hydropower is the dominant renewable energy source in all the world, also in Europe, because also that's a very efficient source of energy, and it also provides the flexibility that is always often needed by the power systems. This is very important, especially if we look at the scenarios for the next decades. You know, if you look at, like, for example, the scenarios for 2050, the European roadmap. So it's really important, the hydropower. It's really important to allow to have higher penetration of the other renewable energy sources in Europe. This is the big picture in the European countries. We have three different types of hydropower. So we have the run-of-river, the storage, so the traditional dams, and also the pumped storage. Those are the three categories that are used by the ENSOE. And in our work, we addressed the first two, and we couldn't use pumped storage. Even if it's as important source, it's not a really renewable energy source because it's not driven by climate factors. So for this reason, we mainly focused on run-of-river and storage hydropower. So in this big picture, you can see for the European countries on the top panel, the amount of installed capacity for pure storage is the light blue, and the dark blue is the run-of-river. And also on the bottom, you can find the fraction of the national generation that is provided by hydropower. This is really important because we can see, especially for example Norway, this is a very important case, that hydropower provides for Norway more than 90% of the national electricity energy. So this is another point on why it's important to provide an estimate of hydropower for the European countries. Well, it's important to say that hydropower is a really challenging renewable energy source in terms of modeling, because it's affected by different factors, some of them meteorological based, I mean precipitation, runoff, snow melts, and also water that is in reservoirs, in the dams, but also in the rivers, can be used for multiple purposes. So there is climate is not the only factor here. And also there are many constraints, so there are national regulations, European regulations, so it's the availability of water can be regulated by different policies, so it's fairly complex in respect to the other renewable energy sources. And also, this is more important, we should need information at basin level. So to model each hydropower dam, we should have information at basin level. Unfortunately, this is not feasible. Well, unless we want to focus only on a few European countries. But given that one of the goals of our project was to provide something at the European level, we had to find something that can be more general as well. So we are, as Laurent has shown for wind power, we also rely on a statistical approach and based on the ENSOE data. We collected the data from the transparency platform that provides electricity, generated electricity for the topologies of hydropower and the stored capacity. As we say, we focused on Rhino River and water reservoir types. We are using the data since the January 2015 to the end of 2016. This was in line with the area interim data that we are using. And well, for some of you, it can be a very short amount of data. Well, actually, it is reality, but the point is that ENSOE, in this case, was the only source of reliable, more or less, data for all the European countries. So we want to stick to this because we want to provide something that could work for all different European countries. Instead, for the meteorological data was easier because we got information from precipitation, temperature, and snow depth from the area interim analysis from ECEM. So that's the big picture. We tried to find a relationship between what you can see on the right, it's just an example of the generation of Rhino River electricity from some European countries, and what you can see on the left. There is the three meteorological predictors that we selected. So our goal was to find a statistical model that could be able to find this connection between the predictors and the generation of hydropower. But there was a very important question. So this was the most challenging part, because you can imagine that the link between the precipitation of snow and the generation of electricity is not really instantaneous. I mean, the point is the generation of time t is not only linked with the precipitation or snow at the same time step. So we designed this strategy. We provide also as a predictor the rolling sum, the moving sum, as you prefer to define it, of the last n days of precipitation and snow. So it was a kind of accumulation, and this is the main question. What is the value of this, or width of this window where to compute the moving average? So in other words, we also find a connection between the generation at time t and, for example, the sum of the precipitation in the last n days is the same for snow. The point is how we can we find the value of n. So we proposed a simple approach. It was to try all the different value of this window and try to find the value that maximizes the correlation between this cumulative or lagged predictor and the generation. This is, for example, an example for French Rhino River generation, and you can see the correlation between snow depth and precipitation for the different width of this moving sum. And in the end, for example, this is a very clear example, we could say that the generation of hydropower in France was mostly connected with the accumulated snow depth in the last 4 months. The value is something like 122 days, something like that. With this approach, we could try to maximize the information content available in the analysis to optimize the generation of the estimation of this hydropower generation. This is a clear example to show you why, why this is important. This is, you can see in the same, always in France, the generation, a scatter plot between generation and the rolling sum of precipitation of the last 1 day. So it's currently is this instantaneous precipitation. This is what you have if you consider the last 10 days. So the sum of the precipitation the last 10 days. This is again 80 days, 100 days, 120 days. As you can see, in this case, this is why the correlation goes up. In this way, it's clearly evident that there is this kind of connection, relationship between the generation at time t and the accumulation of precipitation of snow in the last 10 days. Well, this is an example for France, and this is, for example, for Italy, always run a river. So we have different curves for all the European countries. This character, this number, sorry, tried to summarize in some sense the peculiarity of each country due to geography, to the power system topology, so there can be multiple factors. In this way, we try with a simple approach, but effective, as you can see, a way to summarize the different aspects for each country in a single number. Well, so I explained to you what are the predictors we used. Now we can see what are our approach. We applied a random forest that is a very well-known and effective machine learning based approach. It consists of an ensemble of regression trees, which is a simple methodology. They are in some sense decorrelated. So this approach can normally, it's a very good choice because it provides very effective and robust estimation. So we, as we said, we used as predictors the array entering data and the observed generation from InSoy platform. And that's the results. Those are the correlation. On the top panel are run-of-river, on the bottom are water reservoir for different European countries. The correlation are computed in out-of-sample, so they are in some sense cross-validated. And this is a very interesting, those are very interesting results. As expected, we got better results with run-of-river because the link between generation and the meteorological factors is more direct. And the bottom, the reservoir, are in some sense are more challenging because the meteorological factor is not the only important aspect in this case. So those are the results. I want to show you a couple of time series just to show you the goodness of this approach. This is against France run-of-river. In blue line is the observed data from InSoy. In the red line is the random forest output. Very good one. And this is, I want to show you what happens if we remove our lagged, moving sum approach. This is what we have. As you can see, this simple but effective, apparently, approach to maximize the information content was really effective. This is for France, another for Spain. This is a reservoir. Against the red is a random forest, blue is a separate one. And this is with without moving average predictors. So that's it. We were surprised to see those very good results at the beginning, but in the end, this was the only possible way to model hydropower. But we are really trying to use this approach, as also Lorena said, to provide estimation for climate projections and hopefully also for seasonal forecast. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matteo. That was a great illustration of the hydropower modeling. And I would also like to encourage people to keep asking questions. We've already received a few, but you can place your questions on the question tab on your control panel at any time. and we will display them at the end. And I also wanted to mention that all the data that Laurent and Matteo have presented are available. Some of them will be amended slightly, but they're generally available on the demonstrator, which is available online, and the aficionados of ECEM will know where to find it, and those that are not familiar with it will soon find towards the end that we'll provide the link so you can enjoy the ECEM demonstrator too. But let's go now to the last talk of the webinar, which is given by Yves-Marie Saint-Renan on solar power. So Yves-Marie, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, in this presentation, I would like to present the last part of the energy variables, which is a calculation of the solar power generation for the entire European domain. Well, sorry, I just have to, yeah. And this presentation is constructed in 3 main blocks, so very standard. First, I would like to put this work into its context to show you how we proceed to make this calculation and present you a small validation of the proposed approach. Yeah, before explaining the detail of the method, I would like to clarify the objectives and the context of the work. Here you can see the slide already shown by Laurent before. It shows the context in which we are working. It's how the ECEM project is working. Our goal is to build up a database of essential climate variables, temperature, wind speed, rainfall, and so on and so on. And we also have the objective of building up a parallel data set of energy variables. And the goal of these energy variables is to be directly usable by a set of targeted end users. So we want this energy variable to be usable by end user for making prospective study of the energy mix. And the particularity of this, it has to be done for each European country. So I also want to pinpoint the point already mentioned by Matteo, is that we could make very complex, very detailed study for one single country that we really well know, but this is not in our objective in this context. We really want to make the job for each European country, and therefore we have to look for a compromise between the detail of accuracy and the quality of the job. So in this presentation, I want to present how we calculate the solar power generation. So it's important here to say that we want not to calculate the power generation of a single plant for a given orientation, but for a given location, it is an aggregated power generation of a fleet of PV plants installed in that particular region. And this is quite tricky because I pick here a small picture from Google Earth in the south of Germany, and you can see in this picture that we have already a lot of PV plants, and all these plants have different size, different orientations, and I think different electrical characteristics. So the question we have to address for making this simulation is how can we take the characteristics of all PV plants into account for this calculation? So with these few words, I hope I clarified the context of this work, the message, and the issue we're facing. And now I would like to step into the calculation we've made for doing this work. The first step was to select a PV plant model for converting the meteorological data into power data. And this model selection is based on a sensitivity analysis, which has been published in a previous job, which shows the sensitivity of the model of the PV output to different PV plant characteristic, but also input meteorological data. And here we can see that a PV plant is the most highly sensitive to the modular orientation, to the peak capacity and the input meteorological data. So it is also sensitive to other parameters, but this subset of parameters is really the most important. And based on this information, we selected a PV plant model. So it's a simple PV plant model. We take the module orientation, the solar radiation, and the air temperature as input parameter, and it allows calculating the normalized PV power generation. Yeah, so maybe to anticipate some questions, there is a lot of further parameter like the temperature coefficient and the Soling loss factor. These parameters have been set to representative values so that we get rid of these influential parameters, and we select these values to be representative for most of the PV plant. Okay, now with this model we are able to make the calculation for one single plant, but our job is not to calculate the PV power generation of one single plant, but of a fleet of PV plants. So the most natural way for calculating the aggregated power generation of a fleet of PV plants would be to calculate the output of each single plant and then to sum them up. But we adopt another approach because we judge this other approach much more efficient in terms of time and computation load. And this approach consists in identifying reference module orientations and calculating the output of our model for each reference module orientation, and to calculate the aggregated power by summing up the output of the model for each reference orientation multiplied by the share of PV plant corresponding to these reference orientations. So we need to do this weighting factor. This weighting factor is a distribution function of the PV plant according to the module orientation, and we need to define this distribution function for any place in Europe actually. For doing so, we refer to a known data set of 35,000 PV plants located in Germany. And you can see in this plot the probability density, the joint probability density distribution of these modular orientation angles. And the first step for us was to learn from this data. So we have a look at the data, and by doing so, try to answer the question if we can generalize this probability density distribution for any place in Europe. And the answer is clearly no, because this data is this distribution is conditioned by economical issue, by architectural habits, or solar resource. So it's definitely not realistic to use this data set for any location in Europe. But we make nevertheless the assumption that the main driver for this distribution is the solar resource, and we express this as by using the optimal tilt angle. The optimal tilt angle is for a given place the tilt angle with which the highest yield is obtained. And for doing this, we express the mean tilt angle here as a function of the optimal tilt angle, and we just have to change this average tilt angle depending on the place in Europe. And to do so, we use a data set of the optimal tilt angle. For this, we use the PVG's data set, which is displayed on the left map here. We'll show very high values of the optimal tilt angle in the mountain regions in Europe. And we thought that these values are not really representative for PV plants, so we decided to get rid of them. And so we correct the database, which look like this. And we use this corrected PVG's data set for doing the calculation. And what is really nice is that at this stage, we have a PV model which doesn't need any other parameters at the optimal tilt angle. So we are able to use it everywhere in Europa. So the first objective is attained. The next question now is to know if this model is yielding good results. And this is what we've seen in the last part, which is the validation part of the work. For this, we consider two countries, France and Germany. So why these two countries? First, Germany is very interesting because we developed the model using German data. So if we don't have good result for Germany, we don't have to look further. So it was very interesting as a starting point. And after that, we had a look to the French situation. Why? Because it's interesting. France has a quite different status with PV regarding PV in comparison to Germany, and France is more southerly than Germany, so it's interesting because the solar ratios depend on the latitude, and therefore it's quite interesting. We use ERA interim data as input data, and we average the output on a 3-hourly. We used TSO data for making the validation. Yeah, and we conducted the validation on a 3-hourly time resolution. The first step of the validation consists in comparing the time behavior of the model output with the reference value, because if we have an error with the module angles, then we see immediately an effect on the time behavior. And as you can see it in this different picture here, the time behavior of the model output, so ECEM, is very similar to the time behavior of the TSO data. So this first test was quite convincing. So we move to the next stage of the validation. Here we first had a look on the scatter plot of the model output against the TSO data, and we see quite nice scatter plot with a small bias for France, but the error metrics are quite satisfactory considering the strong assumption we made, and also the uncertainty of the reanalysis data that we used. So we found this model quite satisfying for our purpose. So in conclusion, I would like to sum up. We propose an approach for calculating the PV capacity factor in Europe. Apart from the optimal slope, no PV plant parameter is needed to implement the proposed model. And the good thing is that there is some database of optimal slope, like PVGs. First validation with TSO data showed that the model output yield very satisfactory results, and further validation would be meaningful, and that could be a possible continuation of this work. This model has been implemented for 33 European countries and 99 regions with reanalysis data, but also with projections, climatic projections, and all this data can be found on the demonstrator. So thank you very much. If you have questions, don't hesitate. I would be very happy to answer them.
That's great, Yves-Marie. That was a very good illustration of the power of your simplified model for solar power, which yields very satisfactory results for our project needs, but more generally, I think would be useful for many applications, similar applications. The only thing I would like to add to what you said is that when we mention ERA interim as input for global radiation, that's not what comes out directly from ERA interim. It's being corrected as part of the ECEM project by Yves-Marie, in fact, and the team. So that's an important step, because you don't want to use the GHR, the radiation that comes out of ERA interim as it is. It needs to be corrected.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so now we move into the question and answer session. We have 6 minutes to the hour, but we'll continue a little bit. So if you're interested, stay on. We have several questions, and we'll I think you can see them now. I'll show them on full screen. I've typed them as they come in, and you still have time to ask your questions if you wish. So I would like to invite Laurent to address the first question, please. So are the demand models of the different countries available and where?
Well, the demand models themselves are not available at the moment, and we don't think we will put them for public access because they are quite, they are not that simple. They need a lot of parameters and so on. But apart from that, the results of the models, so that's to say the daily time series for each country, for the historical period, and for the climate projections are all available on the ECEM demonstrator. And they are also available on the FTP site, which is associated and which is public. So all the time series can be downloaded by anyone who is interested. And if there is a special interest about knowing more about the models themselves and potentially some questions about the use of those models and some more investigations needed, you could contact me directly. But all the data set is available. I think I can skip to the second question as well.
Yes,
so why are you interpolating wind data from 10-meter wind upwards and not using higher level wind data from the models? So the answer is the question has several answers. First, just to refer to what Alberto was just saying about bias adjustment, one of the work packages about the climate data in ECEM was dedicated in bias adjusting the climate variables, so both for the error analysis and for the climate projections. And due to the availability of wind speed data, mainly at 10 meters or close to the surface, this bias adjustment for wind data was available only for the 10-meter data set. And so that's why we used this label. Of course, we could have used the levels, I think it's 58 or 59 from our interim to get something closer to the abate, but it was not possible to bias adjust this data. And the second answer is that we wanted to have a consistent approach between the historical periods, so based on the interim data, and the climate projections. And for the climate projections, we don't have all the model outputs available, but we have, for all of them, we have the 10-meter wind speed. And that's why we also choose this method, because it allowed us to be consistent between the two time periods.
Okay, thank you, Laura. So we come to the question number 3 for Matteo. France is considered with 100% run-of-river hydroelectricity. I guess the question is that correct?
Well, no, not exactly. I mean, according to the ENSOI net generating capacity statistics, in France we have something like 21 gigawatts of run-of-river and something like 3 or 4 gigawatts of pumped storage. For our study, given that pumped storage is not considered, between the bar chart I shown you was the ratio between run-of-river and storage, and obviously considering that France didn't have run-of-river storage installed capacity, yes, it was we modeled only the run-of-river electricity. Can I go directly to question 5?
Yes, I think this can be addressed by all of you if you wish. So you can start.
Okay.
Sorry, number 5. Yeah, number 5.
Yeah. I can also say something about number 4, but in this way they are exactly addressed.
Yes, please. Yeah, sorry, number 5.
We use temperature as predictor. So there are 3. The meteorological variables are 3: snow depth, temperature, and precipitation. And yes, temperature is improves the models. I can imagine just a few reasons, but and also it's a very solid variable and very useful also to get the seasonality. And there is a lack for temperature? No, there isn't, and well, we couldn't see any justification to add this, and we didn't want to increase the number of predictors, because you know, when you're using statistical models, it's always best to keep it simple. So that's the reason why we didn't. I can just add a few words about number 4. Our approach for the power, but I think it's the same for also the other sources, is already ERA5 ready. we tested at least I tested the hydropower with the ERA5 analysis for the data we have. And well, we noted as very slight improvement, but I think that considering we are working on national aggregation levels, the improvement due to the higher resolution, to the higher temporal frequency, is not really can be noticed in this case. But well, when we'll have the entire data set for ERA5, we surely test it more in depth.
Okay, thank you, Matteo. Now we'll ask also Laurent and Yves-Marie. First, before that, I just want to clarify for those that are not familiar with what ERA5 means. ERA5 is the latest reanalysis, so the reconstruction of the past climate. This is the latest product from ECEM or European product, and replaces basically the ERA interim, which was used during ECEM. And this ERA5 will come with higher horizontal resolution, also temporal resolution, and several new features in the physical model. So the quality of this reanalysis is expected to be better, considerably better than what ERA interim offered. It also has other outputs that were not available in ERA interim, such as the 100-meter wind. So we can take 100-meter wind. Going back to question number 2, in this case, we could look at using 100 meters straight away rather than going through 10 meter, although we still have the consistency problem with the projections and seasonal forecast. So over to you, Laurent, for the specifics on implications of ERA5 for energy variables, please.
Yeah, thank you for explaining about ERA5. And of course, due to the increased resolution, both in space and time, we expect strong improvements in the energy models. The first one will be, of course, our time resolution. We will have hourly climate data, which means that it will be possible to assess the diurnal cycle of the energy variables, and especially of solar generation, but also of demands, which is very important. For instance, when you want to study the peak demand and its evolution over time, its variability over time, and so on. So it will be very good for that. And it will also probably allow to have a more local approach to wind power capacity factor and solar power capacity factor, because the resolution will be close to 30-35 kilometers. And so it will be probably possible for people interested in a specific region inside the country to have a more precise look in terms of geographical scope. So yeah, we clearly expect improvements with ERA5, knowing that in the course of the ECEM, which is close to its end, because it will end in early 2018, we won't have time to implement that, and it will be probably the place for a future project.
Okay, thank you very much, Laurent. Would you like to give your point of view, Yves-Marie, in terms of ERA5 implications, please?
Thank you very much. In the current state, since we are using a physical model, we are quite independent from the quality of the input meteorological data. The state, well, where it could be interesting is to really have a better information about the quality of our model, because now when we make the validation, we have a mix of our modeling accuracy and the accuracy of the input meteorological data. But to be honest, we are thinking about the next step where we make some kind of inversion of our physical model, and in this case it would be really nice to have good data. And in that sense, looking at the future, better error 5 reanalysis that would be really beneficial to such studies.
Yeah, if I may, Alberto, I would also add that so for the first stream of error 5, so in principle by June next year, the dataset will be available for 1979 to present time. But then there's a second stream which is planned in principle for 2019, which will go back to 1950. So it will considerably increase the time covered by the analysis by providing close to 70 years of data instead of 40 currently in ERA interim.
Okay, that's great. And basically, what it means that new products that are going to be developed from, say, next year will most likely embed the ERA 5 reanalysis, and will in the future we'll probably see, at least for the next 5-6 years or more, we'll see energy variables based on ERA 5 mainly or only. Notwithstanding that, as we know, there are also other reanalysis, but we have focused on just one reanalysis also for the reason that it takes a lot of time to analyze reanalysis. Each one of them have their own peculiarities. But other studies that Laurent mentioned, for example, for wind, also included other reanalysis, particularly the NASA US reanalysis called MERA. So that is the HEMIRES from JRC and also the NINJA dataset. And we have one last minute question, and then we'll go to number 6. Sorry, we'll accept this last minute question. And have your results already been used for national or international electricity projection studies? Laurent, would you like to take some extra work for you? Sorry.
Yeah, the dataset has been made available in a pre-operational phase only a few days ago. So far the answer is no. But we know that there are at least 1 or 2 new H2020 projects which need similar kind of information. So impact of climate variability and climate change on energy variables, which are going to use the ECEM dataset indeed for energy mixes assessments and so on. So yes, definitely it will be used by other institutions apart from the partners of the project.
That's great. Thank you very much, Laurent. And sorry, there's one generic question about can we have a demo of the ECEM demonstrator? So I put a simple answer there, which is to please look at our website. Particularly if you go to the stakeholder engagement and webinars, where we post all the previous webinars, and there was a specific webinar on the demonstrator in September. You can view both the presentations individually or go through the recording of the session, and you get a good idea of how to navigate the ECEM demonstrator. We also have the demonstrator as a whole here. So the direct link to the demonstrator is provided here, the ECEM demo. There's one word of caution. We've suffered a power cut, unfortunately, today. It's a bit ironic, given that we're giving an energy variable talk webinar. But that's what happened, and if you could bear with us for, I'm told, for another couple of hours, the demonstrator should be up and running again, and you can enjoy it. There will be a few modifications, as I mentioned before, because we provided a lot of data, and we are noticing that some of it is not of the best quality, but this is also to be intended as a demonstration phase. It's a beta version. but we want to demonstrate what is possible. We want to also get your feedback as much as possible. So please report any things that you find, anything that you would like to be done better for future developments. We can report to the Copernicus Climate Change Service. And just look around, you'll find a lot of information. We're already using this internally within ECEM to produce several publications. And the interesting thing is that we can look at the electricity and climate variables as a whole for the whole of Europe for now. Hopefully it will be expanded to beyond Europe in the future. But for now, we have a lot to play within Europe. Lastly, I would like to also mention that we have we mentioned the demonstrator webinar that was given in September. There's going to be another one because during the last 2 or 3 months, we upgraded the demonstrator with a lot of data, as I mentioned. And so we're going to provide an update webinar on the demonstrator. And this is going to be in January sometime, and we'll provide a date. So I'd like to thank all the speakers for the excellent presentations. The attendees, you haven't seen the list or how many there were, but we had a lot of attendees for this session, around 35, if you would like to know the number, which is very good for this webinar. And as I said, it will be recorded and provided online, so you can follow, and as well as all the other developments of the ECEM project that are available here on the website provided. So thank you once again for your attention and participation, and I look forward to seeing you at the next ECEM webinar in January. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.